Imagine a world before fire. Night swallowed in complete darkness, every sound in the forest a potential threat. Yet, in this hostile landscape, there lived a forgotten species of human, strong, intelligent, and resourceful. For a time, they thrived, even without the mastery of fire. But then, suddenly, they vanished, leaving only bones and mysteries buried in the earth. Who were they? How did they survive when predators ruled the night? And why did they disappear, almost as if history erased them? Picture a night without fire. No torches, no campfires, not even the faint glow of a spark to ward off the darkness. For the forgotten human species that lived before fire, nightfall was not just an inconvenience, it was a daily descent into danger. Once the sun slipped behind the horizon, the world belonged to predators. The roars of big cats echoed through valleys, the snapping of twigs hinted at something stalking nearby, and every shadow seemed alive. To survive in this kind of world, early humans had to rely on their senses, instincts, and cooperation. They couldn't afford to wander alone. Instead, they formed small groups, huddled together in caves or perched on high ground to avoid the prowling jaws below. Sleep came in shifts. While some rested, others stayed awake, listening for danger, ready to rouse the group at the first sign of movement. If this journey through deep prehistory made you think, made you wonder, or even gave you chills, consider hitting that subscribe button so you don't miss the next story hidden in our ancient past. And if you enjoyed this video, give it a like, it really helps keep these forgotten voices alive. Quick question for you, where are you watching from, and what time is it right now where you are? Drop it in the comments. I'd love to see how far this community really reaches. Food, too, was a struggle. Without fire, raw meat carried risks. So much of their diet depended on plants, roots, nuts, and occasionally scavenged kills left behind by larger predators. Imagine the courage it must have taken to creep up to a half-eaten carcass, knowing the predator could return at any moment. Yet this was survival, daring, risky, but necessary. Their tools were simple, made from stone and bone, but even then, these primitive instruments gave them a fighting chance. Spears hardened in fire did not exist yet, but sharpened rocks and crude clubs became weapons of last resort. Against the fangs of saber-toothed cats or the strength of cave bears, it was rarely enough, but it was something. These humans weren't just enduring, they were learning, adapting to a world that tested them every single night. To understand the lives of this forgotten human species, we need to step into the world as it was then, a world that didn't belong to humans. It belonged to predators. Lions larger than today's, packs of hyenas with bone-crushing jaws, and saber-toothed cats that could leap from the undergrowth in silence. To live in such an environment without fire was to live constantly on the edge of fear. Every sound was a warning. A rustle in the grass could mean a predator circling. A sudden silence in the forest often signaled that something dangerous was near. Early humans became experts at reading these signs, not because they wanted to, but because their lives depended on it. Their hearing, their sense of smell, even their ability to notice tiny details in the environment, all became sharper. They weren't just surviving physically, they were evolving mentally. But survival wasn't just about senses, it was about strategy. These humans understood that strength came in numbers. A lone wanderer rarely lasted long, but a group, moving together, watching each other's backs, could sometimes deter a predator. They may not have had fire, but they had something just as powerful: cooperation. When danger struck, their survival depended on swift communication. A cry, a gesture, or even a shared glance was enough to trigger action. Still, the balance of power wasn't in their favor. In a contest between a human with a stone and a predator with fangs and claws, the outcome was obvious. That's why caution became their greatest weapon. They learned to move silently, to stalk rather than be stalked, and to retreat when the odds were against them. In this world, survival wasn't about dominance. It was about endurance. For this forgotten human species, every day was a gamble against nature. They had no permanent shelters as we think of them today, only caves, rocky overhangs, or makeshift hideouts made of branches and skins. But even these offered little safety. A cave could be invaded by a bear, a den could be overrun by snakes, and the night always belonged to predators. Without fire, they had no light to push back the darkness. Imagine the terror of the night, the sounds of wolves howling in the distance, the roar of a big cat much closer than you'd like, and the eerie silence when the forest itself seemed to hold its breath. In such moments, survival meant clinging to one another, bodies pressed close, hoping to go unnoticed until the dawn. Food, too, was always uncertain. They gathered roots, fruits, and small animals, but hunting large prey was dangerous without coordinated tools or flames to drive animals into traps. Often, they were forced to scavenge from the kills of predators, sneaking in after a lion pride had eaten its fill, risking everything for scraps of meat. This wasn't just desperation, it was necessity. And yet, within these struggles, something remarkable was happening. Their brains were learning. Every failed hunt, every close call with a predator, every desperate night huddled in fear, all of it shaped their instincts and behaviors. They weren't just surviving in the shadows of giants. They were slowly preparing for the moment when they would step out of those shadows. These fragile beginnings, marked by fear and uncertainty, laid the foundation for what humans would eventually become: survivors, thinkers, innovators. To understand the world of this forgotten human species, we need to step back into their environment, a planet ruled not by humans, but by beasts of unimaginable size and power. Picture towering mammoths shaking the earth beneath their feet, massive rhinoceroses with horns like spears, and saber-toothed cats with fangs longer than your hand. These were not creatures from myths, they were real, and our ancestors lived side by side with them. For this species, every encounter was a gamble. A mammoth could provide food, bones, and skins, but only if the group could survive its crushing strength. A saber-tooth might stalk them silently through tall grass, striking without warning. Even packs of giant hyenas and wolves posed a deadly threat, circling camps, waiting for the weak or careless to stray. And it wasn't just predators they had to worry about. Other human-like groups roamed the same lands, competing for food and shelter. These weren't friendly encounters, they were rivals, and sometimes even enemies. Imagine stumbling across another group at a watering hole, both sides eyeing each other warily, hands gripping stone tools, deciding whether to share, fight, or flee. This was a world where survival wasn't guaranteed, not even close. The balance of power leaned heavily in favor of the animals, not the humans. To exist in such a place required constant alertness, sharp instincts, and courage in the face of overwhelming odds. It was a world of giants, where humans were not rulers but survivors clinging to life at the bottom of the food chain. And yet, in this crucible of danger, something powerful began to stir, the first sparks of strategy and cooperation. While towering herbivores shaped the landscape, it was the predators that carved fear into the daily lives of this forgotten species. Imagine crouching in the flickering light of a campfire, every crack of a twig in the darkness sending chills down your spine. Beyond the glow, unseen eyes watched, patient, calculating, waiting. The saber-toothed cats were the ultimate hunters. With muscles built for ambush and teeth capable of slicing through flesh and bone, they were nightmares made real. Unlike lions today, they didn't roar to announce their presence. They stalked silently, shadows slipping between rocks and trees until it was too late. One wrong move, and an entire group could lose its strongest hunter. But cats weren't the only threat. Packs of dire wolves moved with relentless coordination, testing the edges of human groups, lunging at the weak, stealing food. Imagine dozens of glowing eyes reflecting the moonlight as they surrounded a small band of weary travelers. Even giant eagles, swooping from the sky, could snatch away a child in a heartbeat. The constant shadow of predation left a mark on these humans, not just physically, but mentally. Fear wasn't just an emotion, it was a survival tool. It sharpened their senses, teaching them to notice subtle changes, a shift in the wind, the silence of birds, the fresh imprint of a paw in the mud. Over generations, these instincts hardened into reflexes, wiring their brains to detect danger faster than thought. Living under the predator's gaze was terrifying, but it also forged resilience. They learned not only to hide and escape, but to observe, to anticipate, and eventually, to fight back. This was the beginning of something greater, the slow climb from prey to predator. For this forgotten human species, life was a constant balancing act. They weren't the apex hunters we think of today. They were somewhere in the middle, caught between giants they couldn't challenge and predators they couldn't always outrun. To survive, they had to carve out a niche that depended on wit, cooperation, and courage. When larger animals killed, these humans often lingered nearby, waiting for their chance. It was dangerous. Approaching a carcass meant risking an ambush from predators who might still be watching. But if timed right, scavenging meant access to rich marrow and nutrient-packed organs. Those daring enough to take this risk gave their groups the calories needed to endure the cold and hunger. Yet, Survival wasn't just about scraps. They began to hunt in groups, coordinating silently with hand gestures, pushing prey into traps, or driving animals toward cliffs. These were not the refined hunters of later ages, but the seeds of strategy were already there. In those moments, they stepped closer to controlling their environment rather than being controlled by it. Still, their rivals weren't only beasts. Other human species roamed these lands, equally desperate for food and shelter. Competition wasn't always a bloody clash. Sometimes it was the subtle stealing of resources, the quiet stalking of another group's hunt. But other times, the encounters turned violent, and bones cracked beneath stones or clubs. To them, rival humans could be as dangerous as any predator. This fragile position, not quite dominant, never entirely safe, defined their existence. It forced innovation, social cohesion, and a relentless sharpening of survival skills. They lived in the tension between prey and predator, a tension that would shape not only their fate, but the destiny of humankind itself. For generations, this forgotten human species endured, but even the strongest survival strategies have limits. Slowly, cracks began to appear in their world. Climate shifts grew harsher, pushing icy winds deeper into their valleys, freezing rivers earlier, shortening the seasons when food could be found. What had once been a challenging life became brutally unforgiving. Scarcity of resources forced desperate choices. Hunters returned empty-handed more often, and the once reliable scavenging opportunities dwindled as predator populations shifted or migrated. Starvation crept into their camps, and malnutrition weakened both bodies and spirits. A species already walking a tightrope began to wobble. But the threat wasn't only environmental. Other human species were rising, stronger, smarter, and more adaptable. Early Homo sapiens, with their sharper tools and budding mastery of fire, began expanding into new territories. Where these two groups met, conflict was inevitable. Whether it was direct violence or quiet displacement, the weaker often lost. This collision wasn't just physical, it was cultural. The rivals carried with them ideas, technologies, and cooperation strategies that tipped the balance of survival. Compared to them, the forgotten humans seemed slower to adapt, clinging to traditions that had served them for centuries but now left them vulnerable in a rapidly changing world. And so, the cracks widened. Families once bound tightly together began to scatter in search of safer lands. The mighty predators that once defined their fears were no longer the only danger. The greatest threat came from hunger, from competition, and from the shadows of extinction slowly creeping closer. In the frozen silence of prehistory, a question began to emerge. Could they endure the storm, or would time itself erase them? As their world tightened around them, survival became a daily battle. Each sunrise brought uncertainty. Would the hunters return with food, or would the camp fall silent that night? Mothers clutched their children closer, sharing what little scraps of meat or marrow remained. The elders, once the keepers of wisdom, grew weaker, their voices fading with hunger. It wasn't just the cold or the lack of prey. Diseases, likely spread through close living quarters and contact with rival groups, chipped away at their numbers. What once would have been survivable illnesses now became fatal in bodies already weakened by starvation. Small setbacks became devastating blows. And then came fire. Not their fire, but the fire of others. Early Homo sapiens wielded it with skill, not only to warm themselves or cook food, but as a weapon, a tool of dominance. The forgotten humans must have looked on in both awe and terror. Fire could drive away predators, clear land, and harden spear tips. Against such power, their older ways seemed suddenly inadequate. Competition for resources grew fiercer. Imagine a frozen hunting ground where two groups converged on the same herd. One armed with sharpened wooden spears and instinct, the other with fire-hardened weapons, cooperation, and strategy. The outcome was often predictable and devastating for those already on the brink. Yet despite the odds, they resisted extinction with sheer will. They clung to their traditions, passed down stories around dim flickers of flame, and adapted in small, desperate ways. Their resilience was remarkable, but time was no longer on their side. Every loss, every empty belly, every failed hunt chipped away at their future. The shadow of extinction grew larger, and the question became not if they would vanish, but when. The end didn't arrive in a single moment. No great catastrophe wiped them out overnight. Instead, it was a slow unraveling, a quiet fading of voices across generations. One by one, the camps grew smaller. Fires were left to burn out with no one to stoke them. Songs that had once echoed in caves and valleys fell silent, their meaning vanishing with the people who carried them. Some groups may have merged with rising populations of Homo sapiens, their bloodlines absorbed into the tide of history. In this sense, perhaps they didn't entirely vanish. Fragments of their DNA might still flow through us today. But as a distinct people, with their own language, customs, and way of seeing the world, they disappeared. Imagine the last survivors, a handful of weary men, women, and children gathered in a frozen clearing. Their clothes threadbare, their bodies thin, their eyes filled with a knowledge that their time was ending. They might have looked at the horizon, where smoke from other human fires curled into the sky, and realized they no longer had a place in this changing world. For thousands of years, they had hunted, thrived, and carved out an existence in some of Earth's harshest environments. Yet evolution is unforgiving. The competition wasn't just for food, it was for survival strategies, intelligence, and innovation. And when those measures fell short, extinction became inevitable. All that remained were bones buried in the earth, tools scattered in caves, and whispers in our genetic code. Their story, nearly forgotten, lingers not as a tragedy alone but as a reminder. They walked before us, struggled before us, and shaped the very path that made us human. The silence they left behind still echoes today. The story of the forgotten human species isn't just about extinction. It's about resilience, adaptation, and the fragile threads of survival that connect us all. These beings once ruled their world with fireless strength, yet in time, they vanished, leaving behind only traces for us to piece together. Their fate is a reminder that humanity has always walked a razor's edge between survival and oblivion. But here's the truth: their struggles shaped us. Every tool we hold, every story we pass down, every community we build, all of it carries the echoes of those who came before. They may be gone, but they live on in us, in our resilience, in our creativity, and in our drive to keep pushing forward.